Hello, and welcome to Cognitive Drift. Sometimes a place that promises peace ends up holding people in ways they never expected. And that's where this story begins. Many people have walked into a church looking for support, only to walk out years later wondering how the experience felt less like a community and more like a controlled environment. Not always dramatic, not always extreme, but familiar in ways that match what we typically associate with cult behavior. And that similarity can be unsettling. The word cult is emotionally loaded, so it's important to get one thing clear right away. This isn't about name-calling, it's about patterns, psychological patterns, social patterns, and behavioral patterns that show up across groups that rely on obedience, authority, and unquestioned truth. Patterns that often emerge in churches without most members ever noticing. People don't join a cult, they ease into one, through repeated messages, slow changes in thinking, and a growing pressure to belong. And the same slow, subtle shaping can happen in religious environments that are supposed to be about spiritual freedom. One of the first signs is the way certainty is handled. In most areas of life, uncertainty is normal. We update our ideas when new information comes in. But in many churches, doubt is treated like a spiritual disease, something dangerous, something shameful. And when people are told that questioning the system is the same as questioning their worth or morality, the group gains a level of control that goes far beyond ordinary community life. This pressure becomes especially strong when leaders present themselves as the only trustworthy interpreters of truth. Maybe not by shouting it, but through constant subtle reminders. Their sermons shape how people should think. Their advice sets the limits for what's considered acceptable. And disagreement becomes something you keep quiet about, because speaking openly means risking alienation. Cult-like behavior doesn't require a charismatic, wild-eyed figure at the front. All it takes is a structure where authority flows only one direction, and loyalty is valued more than critical thought. Over time, members start repeating the same phrases, absorbing the same beliefs, and filtering their experiences through the same lens. And it begins to feel normal, even comforting, because familiarity always feels safer than uncertainty. Another pattern is the way some churches try to define people's identities, not just their beliefs, but their sense of self. Instead of being a person who has doubts, desires, and flaws, you become a member who must fit a template. Your purpose is already chosen, your worldview is already built, and your role is to stay within the boundaries the group lays out. This identity shaping often starts early. Children are taught that belonging is not just encouraged, it's necessary. Stepping outside of the belief system is framed as dangerous, rebellious, or spiritually failing. And because humans are wired to seek acceptance, that message becomes internalized long before the child understands what belief even means. Researchers who study high control groups often mention thought-terminating cliches, short phrases designed to shut down deeper thinking. Churches sometimes use these too, even unintentionally. Lines like, "God works in mysterious ways," or "You just need more faith," become easy answers to complicated questions. And once these phrases are repeated enough, they create mental shortcuts that override doubt with automatic obedience. This isn't accidental. It's a natural outcome of environments where challenging the narrative is discouraged. When members are taught that questioning the group is equivalent to questioning the ultimate source of truth, the pressure to comply becomes enormous. Social separation is another major factor. In many churches, a line is drawn: us and them, believers and non-believers, saved and unsaved, insiders and outsiders. And once people see the entire world through this binary lens, leaving becomes frightening. Because walking away doesn't just mean disagreeing, it means risking relationships, identity, and even the fear of eternal consequences. This dynamic mirrors what psychologists call bounded choice, a system where people technically have free will, but every option outside the group is framed as harmful. So the only safe choice is staying in, even if it no longer feels right. And when a group positions itself as the only source of moral clarity, it gains enormous social power. Members begin to rely on the church not just for spiritual direction, but for answers about relationships, politics, sexuality, family decisions, career choices. And once that reliance grows deep enough, leaving feels like losing the map to life itself. Consider how isolation works in high-control groups. It's rarely physical isolation. It's psychological. You're surrounded by people, but only people who think the same way, who reinforce the same ideas, who repeat the same stories. And that repetition becomes a mental environment that's hard to break out of. Many people who eventually leave say they didn't realize how much pressure they were under until they stepped outside, like taking off a backpack you didn't know you were carrying. When you're inside, everything feels normal because everyone around you is living the same way. But once you step back, the patterns become visible. Another sign is the way some churches handle confession and guilt. In healthy communities, admitting mistakes leads to growth. But in high-control environments, guilt becomes a management tool. Members are encouraged to constantly examine themselves for spiritual failure, an endless cycle of unworthiness and repentance that keeps them emotionally dependent on the group for reassurance. Guilt is powerful. It keeps people in line without the need for explicit threats. And when guilt is tied to cosmic consequences, eternal reward or eternal punishment, the pressure becomes overwhelming. Fear doesn't have to be shouted to be effective. Sometimes it's just implied over and over until it settles into the mind. And then there's the secrecy. Not always dramatic secrecy, but subtle avoidance of transparency. Questions about finances, leadership behavior, or historical claims are often brushed aside. Members are told not to worry about contradictions or inconsistencies. The group always has a reason, even when none is given. And when people are discouraged from looking deeper, they become dependent on the group to define what is and isn't worth knowing. Sociologists studying religious authority note something interesting. The more sacred a claim is, the less likely the group is to allow scrutiny. Divine authority is hard to question because the source cannot be reached. And when leaders claim to speak for this unreachable authority, they gain unchecked power, not through force, but through belief. This dynamic becomes even stronger when the church frames itself as persecuted. Many high-control groups build a narrative of constant external threat. They claim that outsiders hate them, misunderstand them, or are trying to destroy their faith. This siege mentality creates loyalty, because when you believe the world is against you, the group becomes your only safe place. Psychologically, this is known as tightening the circle. Any criticism, even mild, is reframed as an attack. And once that lens is in place, members ignore red flags because they view internal problems as less dangerous than the imagined threat from outside. Another overlooked similarity is the way some churches promise simplicity in a complex world. All big questions have simple answers. All doubt leads to danger. All morality is predetermined. And while this feels reassuring at first, it gradually becomes restrictive. People stop learning, stop exploring, stop questioning. The world becomes smaller, narrower, easier to control. Even the emotional highs, the music, the group energy, the heightened atmosphere can create dependency. Intense group experiences release chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin, which strengthen social bonds. And when these emotional peaks are tied to religious messaging, members often associate spiritual truth with emotional intensity, making it hard to leave without feeling a sudden emptiness. The emotional environment becomes part of the belief system, a psychological feedback loop that keeps people returning, not for doctrine, but for the feeling it gives them. And like any environment built around emotional reinforcement, It encourages loyalty beyond logic. It's important to say that not every church exhibits these patterns to the same degree. Some are open, questioning, and genuinely supportive, but many follow predictable psychological structures that match what researchers describe as high-control groups. The difficulty is that churches rarely appear coercive on the surface. They present themselves as moral centers, community hubs, family-friendly spaces. So the control is wrapped in warmth, language of love, and a sense of belonging, which makes the underlying pressure even harder to recognize. One of the strongest indicators of a cult-like environment is how the group treats people who leave. In healthy communities, relationships continue even after someone walks away. But in many churches, leaving is treated as betrayal. Friendships fade. Social circles collapse. Sometimes families distance themselves, and the emotional cost of leaving becomes so high that people stay even when their beliefs no longer match the group. This social punishment doesn't need to be explicit. It's often unspoken, just a quiet shift in how people treat you. But the message is clear. Belonging is conditional. Another overlooked similarity is the rewriting of personal history. People are encouraged to see their past as broken, misguided, or empty, and their life in the church as the only meaningful version. This creates emotional dependence, because the group becomes the source of identity, purpose, and direction. Once that psychological framework is in place, leaving feels like losing your entire sense of self. Many former members describe a similar moment. When they start questioning, they feel guilty. When they keep questioning, they feel anxious. When they try to walk away, they feel terrified. Not because the church physically stops them, but because their inner world has been shaped to fear life without the group. This internal fear is one of the clearest signs of high-control influence. Healthy communities don't make people afraid to leave. Another pattern is the selective use of history. Churches often present their tradition as ancient, consistent, and unchanging. But in reality, doctrines shift over centuries. Texts evolve. Leaders disagree. Entire belief systems fracture and reform. And yet members are often taught that their particular version is timeless and divinely protected. This selective storytelling creates an illusion of certainty, and illusions are powerful tools of control. When people believe they belong to a perfect, unchanging truth, they stop questioning inconsistencies. They overlook contradictions, historical issues, and moral problems, and certainty becomes more important than accuracy. Psychologists often point out that humans crave meaning, and groups that offer absolute meaning in a chaotic world hold extraordinary power, not through logic, but through emotional security. This is why people stay in environments that control them more than they realize. The world outside feels uncertain, unpredictable, and lonely, while the world inside feels structured and guided, even if that structure comes with pressure, guilt, and fear. When people finally step out, they often describe a period of decompression. Suddenly they have to rebuild their identity, their relationships, their worldview. All the things that were shaped by the group now have to be rediscovered. And that process can feel overwhelming, but it also reveals how much of their inner world had been molded without them noticing. The question isn't whether churches are cults. The question is why so many people walk away feeling like the experience was more controlling than spiritual, why the psychological patterns match so closely, and why so many former members describe the same emotional journey. Maybe the answer lies in understanding how human behavior works. Whenever a group offers certainty, belonging, authority, and purpose, especially with a promise that extends beyond this life, it becomes fertile ground for control, even if the people running it are sincere. We're all vulnerable to environments that shape the way we think, especially environments built on deep meaning and identity. But awareness is the first step toward understanding, and understanding is the first step toward freedom. Church doesn't have to feel like a cult, but many people discover, too late, that the patterns they trusted were designed not to empower them, but to hold them, gently, subtly, and completely. And once you see the pattern, it's hard to unsee it, and that's where the experience becomes complicated, because most people inside don't feel controlled. They feel guided, supported, surrounded by people who share their values, and that sense of belonging can hide the mechanisms shaping their choices, even from themselves. Control doesn't always look like domination. Sometimes it looks like love with conditions, acceptance with boundaries, comfort that slowly becomes confinement. And when a community uses emotional dependence instead of open dialogue, members gradually sacrifice pieces of themselves for the sake of harmony. Another subtle pattern is the way language is used. Churches often develop their own vocabulary, words loaded with meaning that only make sense inside the group. Phrases like spiritual warfare, being covered, walking in obedience, or staying under authority create a linguistic world of their own. And the more a person uses this language, the more their thoughts begin to operate within its limits. Language shapes reality. And when a group controls the language, it can subtly guide what members consider possible, acceptable, or even thinkable. This is why high-control groups of all kinds lean heavily on internal jargon. It creates an invisible boundary around thought itself. The church environment often reinforces this boundary through constant repetition. Weekly sermons, small groups, prayer meetings, devotionals, each one reinforcing the same ideas, the same worldview, the same framework. And repetition is one of the most powerful tools for shaping belief, not because people are forced to accept something, but because familiarity slowly becomes truth. Over time, this repetition becomes a mental rhythm, and breaking out of that rhythm feels jarring, even painful, like stepping out of sync with people who once felt like family. Another overlooked element is the moral hierarchy. In many churches, certain people are considered more spiritually mature simply because they conform more closely to the group's expectations. Their status is tied to obedience rather than understanding. And when obedience becomes a pathway to respect, independent thought becomes a liability. People who question too much often find themselves subtly pushed to the margins, not explicitly punished, but quietly excluded. Invitations stop coming. Conversations feel colder. Leadership opportunities vanish, and the social cost becomes a warning to everyone else. Fear of exclusion is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. Even small hints of rejection can shape behavior. And when belonging is tied to spiritual identity, the pressure multiplies. Another sign is the way churches handle testimonies, personal stories that are shaped into narratives of transformation. These stories often follow predictable patterns: a life of confusion, a dramatic turning point, and a new identity found through the group. And while these stories can be sincere, they also reinforce the message that real meaning only exists inside the church. This creates a psychological loop. Members hear stories that mirror the ideal narrative. They reshape their own experiences to match that narrative. And the group celebrates stories that reinforce its authority. Over time, personal history becomes edited to fit the expectations of the community. Memory itself becomes part of the belief system. And then there's the issue of exclusivity. Many churches claim they have the truth in ways that place all other perspectives as inferior, misguided, or dangerous. And exclusivity is one of the strongest markers of high-control groups. Because once people believe their community alone holds the path to meaning or salvation, they'll tolerate almost anything to remain inside. This exclusivity also creates an emotional dependency. If the group is the only source of truth, leaving feels like stepping into darkness. And that fear alone can keep people from questioning, even when doubts grow stronger. When researchers interview people who leave high-control religious groups, many describe a moment when they realize they're living two internal lives, an outer life of conformity and an inner life of questions, and maintaining that split becomes exhausting. Eventually, the tension becomes impossible to ignore, and that's when the internal world begins to crack open. The process of leaving is rarely sudden. It's usually slow, quiet, and painful. People often describe feeling like they're betraying their family, their friends, even themselves. Guilt, fear, and confusion blend together. And yet beneath it all, there's a sense of clarity they can't shake. That clarity is the beginning of autonomy, the moment when a person realizes that their thoughts belong to them again, that their questions matter, that their identity doesn't need approval to exist. And once the mind begins to reclaim itself, the entire structure that once felt sacred begins to feel constructed. Not evil, not malicious, just human, built by people, shaped by culture, influenced by history, and maintained by psychological forces that often go unnoticed. This realization doesn't erase the good that people may have found in church, the friendships, the support, the moments of comfort, but it places those things in context. It separates genuine connection from institutional control. Many people say that leaving feels like stepping outside after being in a room with tinted windows. Everything looks different, clearer, not always easier, but more honest. The world becomes bigger again. Possibilities open up, curiosity returns, identity expands beyond labels, and people begin to rebuild their worldview piece by piece, using logic, evidence, experience, and personal reflection instead of inherited doctrine. What's striking is how many former members, regardless of background, describe similar patterns, similar pressure, similar fear, similar relief. And that consistency is one of the strongest indicators that these environments often operate in ways that affect human psychology more than most people realize. The point isn't to condemn individuals inside the church. Most are sincere, kind, and trying their best to live meaningful lives. The issue is the structure, the way authority, certainty, identity, and fear intertwine in systems that claim to have absolute truth. Anything that claims absolute truth gains absolute power. And absolute power, even in the softest form, shapes the mind more deeply than most people expect. When a group decides what questions are allowed, what doubts are acceptable, what information is safe, and what identity is permitted, it crosses a subtle line. A line that separates community from control, guidance from obedience, support from surveillance. And once that line is crossed, even unintentionally, the environment begins to resemble something far more controlling than most members will ever see from inside. Understanding these patterns doesn't mean rejecting everyone who finds comfort in church. It simply means recognizing the mechanisms that shape the experience, the psychological tools that make certain environments feel safe while slowly limiting the very freedom they claim to protect. Awareness gives people the ability to step back, to examine the structure, to separate belief from pressure, to distinguish personal values from collective expectations. And once you can see the structure clearly, it becomes easier to understand why so many people walk away with the same realization. That what they thought was spiritual guidance sometimes felt more like psychological conditioning. That what they believed was community sometimes acted like control. And that what they hoped was freedom sometimes functioned like a cage, gentle, polished, and wrapped in promises. But here's the most important part. Once people recognize these patterns, they're no longer at their mercy. They can decide what to hold on to and what to let go of. They can rebuild their identity without fear. They can choose relationships based on mutual respect instead of shared doctrine. They can explore ideas openly, without guilt or shame. They can finally breathe in a way they didn't realize they weren't breathing before. And in that freedom, they discover something the church could never offer: the power to shape their own beliefs, their own purpose, and their own path, without fear of punishment or pressure to conform. Once that freedom is felt, it's hard to forget, and even harder to give up. Because once you see the structure from the outside, once you understand the patterns, once you feel the weight lift, you begin to realize that the world is much larger, richer, and more open than you were ever allowed to believe. And in that realization, the question changes from, why does the church feel like a cult, to something far more personal. How did I ever accept a world that small, when the world outside was waiting for me all along? Leaving a controlling environment doesn't erase the impact it had. Habits, thought patterns, and fears linger long after the doors are closed. Even years later, former members describe automatic guilt when they question authority, or a lingering sense of needing approval for every choice. These are echoes of conditioning, subtle but persistent. Rebuilding from that takes time. It involves learning to trust your own judgment again, to listen to your own instincts instead of internalized rules, and to separate morality from group approval. People often discover that they can be ethical, compassionate, and meaningful without adhering to a rigid system that once dictated their every thought. The process is deeply personal. For some, it's joyous, liberating. For others, painful and confusing. But in every case, it reveals one undeniable truth. Human beings, naturally, seek connection, certainty, and meaning. And when those needs are channeled into rigid structures, the result can feel like control, even when the intention was sincere guidance. Churches, at their best, can offer community, support, and moral guidance. But the patterns that resemble cult behavior show up whenever authority is unquestioned, doubt is discouraged, and belonging is conditional. These aren't always obvious. They hide in subtle expectations, repeated phrases, emotional highs, and social pressures. And the longer someone is immersed, the harder it becomes to recognize them. Awareness, reflection, and questioning are the tools that allow people to break free from those patterns. Not rebellion for the sake of it, but careful observation of how a community shapes thoughts, beliefs, and identity. Noticing the signs that loyalty is valued over honesty, obedience over understanding, and fear over freedom. It's also worth noting that leaving doesn't have to mean abandoning community entirely. Many former members go on to build meaningful relationships, support networks, and social circles that are voluntary, flexible, and mutually respectful. Relationships where differences are celebrated instead of punished, where questions are welcomed instead of shamed, and where belonging is unconditional rather than earned through conformity. In a way, stepping outside allows people to redefine spirituality, morality, and purpose on their own terms. No one else's authority needed, no fear of punishment, no pressure to conform, just the freedom to think, explore, and live authentically. And that's perhaps the most radical thing of all. Not the rejection of belief, but the reclamation of self, the ability to form convictions without being molded by tradition, authority, or social pressure, to understand that meaning, purpose, and morality can exist independently of institutional approval. That process changes more than belief systems. It changes how people interact with the world, how they relate to others, how they view authority, how they make decisions, and how they understand themselves. It's not always easy, but it's transformative, because freedom, once tasted, becomes impossible to ignore. In the end, recognizing the patterns that make a church feel cult-like is a step toward clarity, autonomy, and self-determination. It's about understanding how human psychology interacts with social structures, how the desire for certainty and belonging can be used to shape behavior in ways that feel natural, normal, and even comforting. And once that understanding is achieved, people can navigate future communities with discernment, joining not out of fear, guilt, or pressure, but because the group truly aligns with their values and choice. And that kind of choice is the opposite of control. It's easy to look back and feel anger, betrayal, or regret. But it's also possible to look back and see resilience, awareness, and growth, the ability to survive, question, and ultimately step beyond the invisible boundaries that once confined thought and identity. What emerges is a profound lesson about human nature, about how easily environments can shape belief without coercion, how subtle pressures can guide behavior more effectively than force, and how critical self-awareness is in maintaining autonomy in any social or spiritual setting. The parallels between churches and high-control groups aren't about demonizing individuals or traditions. They're about recognizing patterns that affect anyone, regardless of faith, culture, or background. They're about understanding that control often masquerades as comfort, obedience as devotion, and fear as care, and that seeing these patterns is the first step toward genuine freedom. Walking away from such an environment is never simple. It's messy, emotional, and deeply personal, but it's also an opportunity to reclaim one's mind, heart, and life, to rebuild identity on personal terms, not dictated by tradition or authority, and to discover that the world is wider, more complex, and more alive than the boundaries once imposed could ever suggest. And once that freedom is embraced, once the subtle pressures are recognized and released, the realization becomes clear. Belonging, meaning, and morality don't have to come at the cost of thought, choice, or autonomy. They can exist in a space that is fully human, fully voluntary, and fully alive. Because ultimately, control thrives in the absence of awareness, and awareness, once awakened, is unstoppable. It allows people to live fully, think freely, and experience connection without compromise. And that is the opposite of a cult, even when the lines were blurred for so long. And in that clarity, the question that once felt impossible to answer finds its own resolution, not in condemnation, not in rebellion, but in understanding, in reclaiming the self, the mind, and the life that was always meant to be free.